Welcome everyone to our webinar, COVID-19 and its legal implications for patients in nursing homes, hospitals, acts of medical malpractice and accidents. My name is Bobby Hankinson, and I am a digital media specialist for Schneps Media, the publisher of the Queens Courier, Long Island Press, AM New York, Brooklyn Paper, and more. I am so excited today to be joined by John Ciafone, the winner of the Bethpage Best of the Boro and the Dime Best of Brooklyn Best Attorney. And he will be sharing his insight with us today. As we go through the discussion, if you could please share any questions you may have in the chat or using the Q&A function. I'll be monitoring both and sharing information if I can in real time, and also passing that on to John. Afterwards, any unanswered questions, I'll be more than happy to share John's contact information to continue the conversation. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to John to begin.
Greetings, everybody. Thank you, Bobby. Bobby's my co-pilot here. I want to thank each and every one of you for tuning into this webinar, this informative webinar in this pandemic COVID-19 time. It reminds me of for us New Yorkers here and anyone else who's joining the devastation of 9/11. This is to that level, if not could even worse for that matter. But I want to thank all of you for joining. It's going to be a very informative webinar. I'm touching many different areas, from nursing homes to hospitals, accidents, medical malpractice, wills, and estates. It's a very comprehensive webinar. We'll be taking your questions. Let me start first, though, and to introduce myself personally. I'm an attorney. My name is John Ciafone. I've been practicing over 25 years in the state of New York, New Jersey, and Washington, D.C. I have a lovely wife, Gina, and 3 lovely children, John, Paul, Anthony, and Paul. And I thank them every day I'm here. Of course, we have to be grateful, all of us here, if we are with our loved ones and we haven't lost anyone. And those who have lost loved ones, we pray for you, and we'll remember them hopefully in better times. Let me start. I'm a litigator. I've been born and raised in Queens, product of the public schools. I am an EMT and a paramedic trained EMS. And so I want to start with that. I want to thank our first responders, all those people that go out there every day in this pandemic who help us, everyone, including not only fire, nurses, doctors, police, but the people who fill our grocery stores and supermarkets, and the cashiers and the truckers. Everyone who helps us. As an EMT, I have a unique perspective, and as an attorney and an EMT, I've seen a lot of different things, particularly in hospitals and nursing homes. Right now, it's a very controversial issue, the story of nursing homes. They've accounted, at least in New York State, they've accounted for 20 to 25% of the COVID-19 deaths. And while many will say, well, it's only natural, it's ageism, it's people who are sick and people who are old. And I think that's a wrong analysis. These people were put in these conditions unnecessarily, and they died for no reason, most of them. The nursing homes, my experience both as an attorney and as an EMS, are not the best places to be in. Unlike hospitals, they are profit-driven entities. Their bottom line are profits. Hospitals' bottom line, for the most part, is to get people better. Nursing homes are constantly places of neglect. I've seen it, again, as an attorney, but also in terms of my experience as an EMS. Let me tell you a few situations we experienced, me personally, not just EMS in general, but me personally, going into nursing homes, seeing the patients neglected. Many a times as an EMS, I went into a nursing home and we were called for a person who couldn't breathe, having trouble breathing. You get there and the person has no pulse, is not breathing. they're blue, their lips are blue, they've been deprived oxygen for a long time, and the nurse, or they're not nurses, but they're assistants, they say, well, we just discovered this patient. You feel the patient and they're cold, as if they were put in a meat refrigerator, that cold. So you know, as a medical provider, that that person's been in that condition for a long time. And it's troubling. Among us in the EMS, we see that all the time, and we're very disturbed that these things continue to happen. Now, the pandemic only made it worse. You know, in the fall, in the winter, EMS is called many a times to nursing homes for sick patients. And their grounds, we understand, there are grounds for spreading of viruses. Viruses are very commonly spread in these nursing homes, from staph to MRSA. Sepsis is common. These are the things most common in these nursing homes. And we know that, us EMS personnel, and we deal with it with protective gear, with gloves. But what happened with this pandemic only made it worse, where you continued to let people who were diagnosed with COVID-19 back into the nursing homes to continue the spread of people who have weak immune systems with underlying medical conditions. That's really unnecessary. And I'm not going to point fingers at any politician, but definitely the medical director of New York State, the commissioner, should have known better when he ordered sick people back into COVID-19 sick people back into the nursing homes. They should have known better not to do that. There were other areas you could have put these people in, whether it was, you know, the USS Comfort or the Javits Center or any other area that they had set up. Those were the areas where these COVID-19 patients should have been put. So in that discussion, you're going to see a lot of families who are going to be angry when this calms down, to see if anything can be done to address what was wrongfully done to these patients in the nursing homes, to their families, to their loved ones. It needs to be addressed. And I think that the media is covering this correctly so that we can make the appropriate changes in care in these nursing homes, because that has to be done. And I think this pandemic made people aware of really what's going on. And from my experience, again, both as a lawyer, where I covered all kinds of cases in nursing homes, from accidents where people fall down off their beds, break bones, break hips, bed sores, all kinds of bad things happen. Because the reality, as I said, they're driven on profit, not like hospitals, which ultimately their bottom line is a profit. But at least in the hospital setting, you know, you got the doctor, you got the nurse, they're interested in making the person who comes in there better. And they get a pleasure knowing that they've helped someone, helped save a life. As an EMS person myself, our greatest joy was knowing that we saved a life, helping someone, helping the family. And nothing was more satisfying to me when I would get contacted by families or friends and say, you did a great job. You were the one who helped. The patient themselves telling us, if it wasn't for us, they might have not have survived. That's the most gratifying thing a healthcare worker, a frontline worker will get. That means a lot. And that gives them the impetus, him or her, the impetus to continue in that fashion and in that pattern, to continue to do the good work that's needed in these troubling times. I want to wish all the mothers out there a wonderful Mother's Day this weekend. I want to thank Celeste Alleman, Victoria Schneps, Joshua Schneps, and Schneps Communication for hosting this webinar. Again, we're going to give you a lot of information. I'm going to move into hospitals. And if many of you remember from the governor, the mayor, crying, we need ventilators, when this really started, this pandemic, when it elevated. Yes, we did need the ventilators, but what most people didn't understand, particularly the elected officials, the politicians, is that, and we learned this through EMS and paramedic training, is that a ventilator needs to be operated by a specialist. And doctors and nurses don't know how to operate ventilators. They're not trained to operate ventilators. You need a respiratory specialist. It's like like fine-tuning an instrument. You have to be particular, and you have to do your homework, and it's a give and take before a ventilator is working best for a patient. And it's not like pushing a button and putting the stereo on or putting your blender on. It's a give and take. It's fine tuning that they just didn't understand. And a lot of the hospitals, for that matter, didn't have the requisite personnel. So a lot of people were lost in this pandemic due to the inability to get a specialist to operate the ventilator. And you can't blame the hospitals, because just like we weren't prepared for it with the personal protective equipment or the staff, but it's a reality that has to be examined by people, because a lot of people were lost in this pandemic due to the inability to provide, hospitals to provide the requisite personnel to operate ventilators. And you saw the changes in the way the pandemic and the sick patients were treated. They were kind of weaned off the ventilators. They were put on them too quickly, and then they were kind of weaned off to the oxygen. They learned that the oxygen was a lot better if the patient could stay on a machine rather than go onto a ventilator. And that was something that was being, learned as we went along with this. This was a learning for everyone, whether you were an infectious disease doctor. Dr. Fauci, I'll just say a couple of points. He's considered the god of infectious diseases, but he made many mistakes, he himself. In February, he was asked by John Katzimatidis in his radio show, would the pandemic be a problem in the United States? And he said, no, not really. It shouldn't be a problem, in those words. March 9th, he was questioned on another program, would it be advisable to go on a cruise boat? And he says, yes, as long as the boat was fairly clean. Now, this is our specialist. This is the person who was at the right hand of the President of the United States. And this is his area of expertise. So even he made the mistake. I'm not pointing a finger at him, because this is a new virus. That's what they call it, the COVID-19 new virus. But it just demonstrates how even medical experts, even the professionals, they're not gods. They make mistakes. We all learn, all of us, even them. Again, we hope and pray that we get through this and that we don't lose any more lives unnecessarily. This is a tragedy, not only to the families of those who've lost lives, but to businesses, to the economy, and to the world. I'm going to shift into quickly accidents and the courts, and then I'll go into estates. Now, thank God there's not too many people out on the road, in the streets, but everyone's practicing social distancing, I hope. So there's been a reduction in normal emergency room situations, traumatic accidents from cars and trips and falls and sports-related accidents. And that's a good thing. But what's troubling, I've spoken to a lot of physicians, ER physicians in the emergency room, in the emergency rooms, and they're troubled at this aspect. A lot of the heart attack, stroke calls that come in, those are the most common emergency room calls. And of course, gunshots, severe trauma from accidents, but the majority is heart attack and strokes. They're not coming in. And there's a serious concern that people are afraid, and it's common. People are afraid to go into the emergency room. They feel that if they go in there, they're going to get COVID-19, and it could be very well true. Hospitals are notorious for spreading viruses. It's just commonplace. It's, in terms of medical malpractice, if you go into a hospital and you develop a staph infection or MRSA and die from that infection, it's a known complication. You will not recover under the laws of New York State medical malpractice. So it's understood. But these people are not going in, getting themselves checked out. We save a lot of lives by having people going to the ERs with chest pain. Abdominal pain is another common cause for heart attacks. Shoulder pain, it can get disguised. And women, more than men, can have the most uncommon symptoms, and they could be experiencing a reduction of blood flow in their heart, a blockage. And it's very scary to know that there are people with clocks ticking. Unless they get their help, they could die. And that's the other bad part of this pandemic. We're not treating the people we need to. Now, when I said earlier about nursing homes, about the commissioner of New York State, the doctor, medical director, Zucker, stating that allowing patients to go back into the nursing homes who were infected. They also made a decision early on not to resuscitate heart attack, stroke victims. They ordered EMS not to resuscitate heart attack or stroke victims, or at least bring them into the hospitals. You could do the resuscitation at the home or wherever the person was having the code, but if you felt that you couldn't bring them back, you wouldn't take them to the hospital. You would leave them there to die. We learned in paramedic training that you could bring a lot of people back from death. We did many a times. We were able, I was able with the crew to bring people back. Their hearts had stopped and we brought them back. There's drugs that bring people back. Now, whether the people ultimately survive, months later, that is a small number, but some do. And you hear these stories. They're very true, where people's hearts literally stop. They're blue. They haven't had oxygen. And yet we bring them back, and for the most part, they do. Some people live normal lives. But because of this pandemic, it was ordered that that would not be the case if the EMS personnel at the scene determined that that person could not survive. They would leave them in that condition. And this pandemic, where a lot of people died. A lot of people died unnecessarily. As far as accidents, everything, I'm sure most of you know, everything is closed. So statute of limitations for the most part are frozen. Most court matters are frozen. Just emergency situations like custody or very serious criminal matters are heard by the courts, but everything else is on a standstill. I want to talk now about wills and estates. It's important to have a will. I think everyone should ultimately have a will, even if you form a trust. And let me explain the difference between a will and a trust. A will is, I'm sure most people know, is a document expressing your desires of how you want your valuables, your estate to be distributed after your death. Now, in New York and in most states, there is a surrogate law that says, well, if you haven't drafted a will or written a will, it goes to your spouse, it goes to your children. If your children are survived, it goes to the grandchildren. It would go to your parents. There's a pecking order. And a will is important because I've had over the years people come in and tell me, I've helped my son, my daughter, I've given them everything. And I feel that they've treated to charity. I'd rather give it to the church. I'd rather give it to my neighbor who provides food and you'll hear everything. I can almost write a book in terms of the stories that I learned over the years from practicing in this community in Queens. I serviced all kinds of people, from seniors to people, unfortunately, people who were about to die. We'd come in and we helped them with their estates. Let me just shift, talking about to die. You know, the greatest problem, I talk to a lot of the more senior EMS personnel, people that have been doing this for 20, 30, 40 years, and they tell me that this pandemic is the scariest thing that they've experienced. Not just doctors and nurses at the hospitals will tell you the same thing, not in terms of the sheer number of deaths. It's like a real battle, a war. But when you go to a person who's having trouble breathing, who has a fever, who has all the symptoms of COVID-19, and you look at them in the face and they're afraid, and they have this look upon them, this death of look, and they ask you if they're going to make it, and they don't want to die. And if they die, they want this and that. And it's so horrifying. And I think this situation is causing a lot of people to become medical first defense line, to be very traumatized and depressed, because it's never been seen before over a long continuous period of time. You know, at 9/11, you had a terrific situation where, you know, we lost about several thousand lives, but it ended within weeks. If you were in the hospital downtown Manhattan, the patients coming in, it came to a conclusion after a week or so. Here, this keeps going and going and going. You know, every day in New York, we're losing hundreds of people. It's a horrific thing. And so that's the killer here. It hasn't come to an end, that we don't know when it will come to an end. Of course, the numbers are down. There's a glimmer of hope, but things are still bad. And people have to understand that. Let me get back to the estates, and then we'll be taking questions. But so a will is important, whether you have a trust. I'll tell you what the trust is. A trust is a great thing to do, particularly now. So now you read the papers, you watch the news, so many people are dying. It's a horrible thing, hundreds every day. Our funeral home takers, our cemeteries are bursting at the seams. They can't even deal with all the deaths. What do you think when we open up our court system, the courts are going to be able to do, the surrogate court? And here in Queens, or whether you go to Brooklyn or Manhattan, they're going to be bursting from the seams. So all these people who have passed in this tragedy, their families, their loved ones are going to be presenting their wills, if they have wills, their estates. If they don't have a will, they're still going to apply for, if you don't have a will, you apply for administration if you don't have a trust. And I'll discuss the three items. The will, of course, most people know. I'm not going to talk too much about that. If you don't have a will, you have to apply for administration through the surrogate. It's a process. And you apply to become the administrator and to distribute the estate. The best is the trust, and let me tell you why. More than ever, it's important. So applying with the will or through administration with the surrogate. Here in Queens, we have one surrogate judge. It's already, before the pandemic, it was already backlogged due to cuts with the state aid, with limits in the court budget. It's going to be a disaster. Nobody's talking about a crisis. Say this, there's going to be a crisis in the surrogates courts in New York State. All the applications it's going to take years and years particularly the way our financial situation is. The state is in a shortfall, the city is in the red. It's going to be a nightmare. It's going to be a crisis. Nobody's talking about it, but you heard it here on this webinar. And so the best thing you can do is create the trust. The trust is a great document for many different reasons. The trust is great because you didn't have to go to court. You don't have to get the approval of the surrogate. You create a document by an attorney that's witnessed how you want your assets distributed. And again, you don't have to go to the court. So it's a beautiful thing. Here, people with the wills and people that don't have the wills are going to be applying for administration, are going to be waiting possibly years. I really believe that. It already took a long time before pandemic 9. Loved ones' estates resolve quickly. That's a crucial thing. Pandemic trusts are a necessity, just like a will, but a trust more so to get the estate finished and finalized quickly and not have to wait years. The other advantage of the trust is the following: it's a private document. Anything you have in the courts is public information. Anyone has access to it. A will, anyone can look at your will. Will, the administration, that's public record. Your assets are public record, but the trust avoids that. It keeps it private. And why? Another reason I like the trust is not only are you staying out of the court, you're not now in this infinite timeline that could take years. You avoid attorney's fees. A lot of attorneys like to challenge wills and will often harass estates so that they can make money for their clients. Some are unethical, but they do that as a living. Some of them do that. But a person can challenge a will for any reason. A child can challenge it. A stepchild can challenge it. A parent could have a favorite and say, you know, this is my favorite. I want them to have the house, but everybody else gets the other assets. And the other children can contest it. And it becomes expensive and timely. And ultimately, the attorneys are having a feeding frenzy on the estate's assets, and the family gets nothing. They get nothing. After all this fighting, they get nothing. The trust avoids that. It avoids it. And that's the great thing of the trust. However, a lot of lawyers are doing these programs on wills. I tell you to be very careful whether you're doing a power of attorney will. Have an experienced attorney get you that, provide that documentation. Because a will often at times can be improperly done, drafted, or witnessed, and ultimately gets thrown out. And that's an unfair thing, especially for the person who died and they put their intentions in there. Well, they wanted it to be honored, and it doesn't get honored. The trust can get honored, but you got to know what you're doing. And not everyone can write a trust, and it's a specialty. And there are lawyers who just draft these things. They don't know what they're doing. Particularly, I focus on this very interesting case. Famous former Michael Jackson. Remember Michael Jackson, singer? Well, he created a trust. He had lots of money. He had lots of attorneys. He had the best attorneys. So he created this trust, and it was a great document. But they blundered. They didn't transfer the assets into the trust. So a trust is a document. It tells you, almost like a will, how my assets are to be distributed. But the thing is this: a trust means nothing until you fund the trust. So it's like opening a bank account but no money in it, or it's like opening a stock account but putting no money to buy the stock. That's what Michael Jackson did. I'm not blaming Michael Jackson. I'm blaming his high-powered, high-paid attorneys who failed to finish that process, they did not fund the trust, and it became a nightmare. And a lot of people, I started this program out about experts and Dr. Fauci, Mr. Zucker, Dr. Zucker being an expert and making many mistakes. We all make mistakes. Attorneys make mistakes. People make. Another of a great attorney, perhaps the best attorney, we could say, is Chief Justice Warren Burger. Chief Judge, who has expired. He died several years ago, but he was the Chief Judge of the United States Supreme Court, considered probably the smartest attorney, right? To be the Chief Judge of the United States, the highest honor. He passed away, and his estate was valued at about $1 million. And he basic estate practice to avoid paying excessive taxes. And his estate wound up paying more taxes than it should have because it failed to employ some of the tools that would save the estate taxes. And it's a very, very common thing. You'll see many times where celebrities, musicians, I've written articles, make huge mistakes. And these are people with money. They're not common folk. These are people with high-powered counsel and well-respected attorneys and firms that making these kinds of errors. It's mind-boggling, but it happens. So you need to protect yourselves and to be aware of the pits and mindfuls that are very common in this business of estates and trusts and stuff like, and the estate practice. A power of attorney, for example, I'll talk about a power of attorney. It's a very crucial document. What it does is you give the right to someone to whether you could limit your rights, so you can give all your rights, but you could say just to do banking or to pay bills or to deal with my depositing and to pay bills, whatever it is, it's a powerful document. And you give that to a person, whether it's your wife, your son, your daughter, and it's important to have. It's as important to have to me as a will is important to have, because I've seen a lot of people in my practice over the years come in, a husband and wife. A husband might have had stock, a bank account, a piece of property in his name. He develops a stroke or has senility or Alzheimer's. And the wife can't just, the wife comes in, well, that's my husband and here's my marriage certificate. That's not enough. She would have to appoint a guardian, has to go to court. And let me just explain quickly about guardianships. Basically, you have to file a petition with the court. It takes years. The court refers out to referees, guardian ad litems. They bring the psychiatrists in. It's a big process and an enormous expense, where a power of attorney would have saved a document which could cost as much as $75 or $100 with an attorney. You could save $30,000, $40,000 in terms of guardianship fees, costs, and expenses, and time and aggravation involved in the guardianship proceedings. So the power of attorney is an important document. You'll hear of the living will. It's a term that's used, but it's not related to a will. It's a person's directives in the event they're unable to make the decisions due to a stroke or senility or being in a coma. And it directs, I don't want artificial resuscitation. I don't want to be hooked up to machines, a ventilator. It gives the person's directive, and the proxies that come along with it allows that person to like the power of attorney, to make that decision, their children to make the life or death decisions, the hydration decisions, the meal decisions. That's another important part of the estate planning that needs to be looked at, particularly today now when you see how this pandemic, COVID-19, really affected people's lives. And another thought here, the other troubling thing, I was telling you earlier about going to see patients you see the fear in their face, are they going to die due to this virus when you go to their homes? It's a terrible thing. And the other equally terrible thing is whether it's in a nursing home or a hospital, not have the ability to see your loved ones before you ultimately pass away. It's something we've never experienced. We've never experienced, whereby a person who has a COVID-19 disease, virus, is not allowed to see their loved ones, to say, I love you, to the people they care, and to wish their goodbyes to the people they love. It's a terrible thing. And that is the other reason why you have such a large amount of depression among healthcare providers who see this, who cannot, this is incomprehensible, how a person who is dying cannot see their loved ones to say goodbye. It's can't be explained, can't be explained. Talked about wills, we talked about trust. There are two kinds of trust, the revocable, the irrevocable. The revocable, the person keeps control of that, can take the money out, keeps control. The irrevocable, they use that for Medicaid, so you could get Medicaid 5 years after you set up the trust. Now, let me tell you what's going on, another crisis. We talked about crises. I'm not talking just about the pandemic. I talked about the crisis that's going to happen. The crisis in terms of not hiring the right attorney or not getting what you paid for, people not doing their jobs, whether it's in the nursing home, people paying $18,000, families are paying $18,000 a month to get abused and neglected, or in the hospitals, you have your insurance, but you're not given the right medical care. And the other crisis is this. Because of the shortfall in the state budget, it's already announced that Medicaid is going to be cut back. And so I'll just go quickly. People would create these irrevocable trusts so that within 5 years after they distributed the assets into the trust, they could get Medicaid and put in a nursing home. But if you stayed home and you got the assistance at home, there was no look back period. It was a great thing and many people took advantage. That's going to change October 1st, whereby there's going to be a look back period. They could go anywhere back 3 years to see if assets were distributed. Even if you leave your loved one home for purposes of Medicaid, there's going to be a look back period. The other thing is, I predict there will be a tremendous pullback in state-funded nursing homes and stuff like nursing homes, whether it's the nursing home themselves or the care at home. The state's not going to have the money for it, and there's going to be tremendous pullback. And so things are changing, and I predict you're going to have longer years, 10 years. You're going to have longer look backs for home Medicare. It's going to happen because, as you see now, this pandemic, as I said earlier, not only destroying families and lives and people, it's affecting the economy. It's destroying jobs, businesses, budgets. And it's going to be ramifications. And we're going to see it first with Medicaid, where it's going to be completely cut back. Significant portions are going to be cut back for estate planning. And more than ever, things are going to change. So you have to keep abreast of the latest news in the next weeks and months, because things are changing with Medicaid programs. I addressed most of the issues. Let me just say a couple of items that stick out in my mind in terms of when clients came to me with issues. When you do a will or a trust, make sure the person you trust most knows where that document is. I can tell you stories of people dying, and if a person dies, for the most part, in an apartment, the police come and they lock the apartment. No one is allowed in. So how do you get to the will? Well, you go to the court, you say, You ask for an emergency application, see if you can get in, but that could take time. And so it's important to have the person know where the legal documents are. People make the mistake of putting them in a safe deposit box. That could take months to get. And often at times people in their wills, in their trust will say, I want to be buried at some cemetery. I want to be cremated. I want to have an elaborate wake. But that will never be honored because by the time they discover the documents, that person is long buried. Those are common mistakes that happen with people when they fail to alert and advise and inform the people they love and trust of where the documents is, where the documents can be located. And I say trust because people have to be honest. And I've had many situations over the years where I saw people I heard stories of people tearing up wills and stuff because they didn't like what was in the will. Those things happen. So it's mainly the people you trust that have to have the knowledge of where these documents are located. Let me just address this issue, which is very common, and then I'll close up and we'll get some questions because we're approaching 11:45. When I first started practicing, I would get calls. Did you do a will? Many years there for my this and my that. A lot of lawyers would do wills and keep them in their offices, hoping to keep the people coming in, the estates coming in, have the families come back and use them as the estates. And that was a big mistake because a lot of the wills got lost, misplaced, and destroyed. And those people that hired the attorney to do the will never got their wishes when they passed away. And I think that's a bad thing for attorneys to do. It's now looked upon badly. If you do a will, the attorney should not hold it. The attorney needs to give it to the client and let the client hold the will. An original will is probated. No copies are never probated unless someone says that they lost it by accident and can prove it. A copy is deemed to be destroyed because the law is written to require actual documents, not copies, but original documents to be filed. Copies will almost never be accepted. All right, let's take some questions. I'll shift over to Bobby.
Don, thanks so much for all that. A lot of useful information there. We have some folks chatting. Also want to extend their apologies for everybody's loss. Some folks shared they lost some family members in the hospital during this pandemic. So of course, we're very sorry for all of your losses. Just a couple questions. Maybe you've covered a lot of things that people are wondering. One though, as you talked about sort of the state of hospitals and that part of the experience right now, what are some things that people can do during a very crazy time to help set themselves up in the event they need to pursue action later? Are there certain things they could do to kind of keep things in order or keep track of things that might be beneficial down the road?
So you need to get a copy of your medical records. Everything comes down to what's in the medical records. As an attorney who does medical malpractice, cases are made and lost in the medical records. We can't go back with no videotape to see what happened, so we rely on the medical records. You need to get those medical records, bring them to an experienced attorney who does medical malpractice. The attorney who does medical malpractice can't make the decision if medical malpractice occurs. We need to hire an expert who will state under penalties of perjury that that hospital, that doctor, that nursing home departed from the standard of care, and thus we can bring in action. So that's my best advice.
Shifting gears a little bit, a lot of preparing some of these documents now, some of the challenges of being remote and not being able to be in the same room. What are some of the changes that people should be aware of in preparing those documents now in terms of like witnesses and things like that?
Very good question. The governor did a great thing. He allowed for video notaries, particularly in this pandemic, for people to get together, especially on a shutdown, is impossible. So I've been doing it with my clients. I'll draft a will, or whatever the document is, a power of attorney, a trust. We have the teleconferences with the client. I send the client the document by email or mail. We do the video and I see the client signing it. And then I say to the client, email it back to me. I'll notarize it. I do that. I tell the client then to send me the original document that they signed. They send it back by mail, and then I notarize it. And often at times, witnesses will also be in the group. We'll have the witnesses witness this, and then they'll witness. So it's a law that's by the governor. It's a great law because that's what you need now. It's the only way to get these documents completed. Otherwise, they can't get completed.
You mentioned a little bit earlier what happens in the event that someone doesn't have a will or trust prepared, sort of the order of operations that it goes through after that. Are there any supplemental documents or anything like that that may be used in that case, or just sort of like, I know it probably varies case to case, but if a person is lacking that stuff that has, say, already passed, what sort of recourse or what might be some good things to keep in mind if folks are confronting that after the fact?
It's a good point. Documents, but they can't be found. They put them in they lock them in some drawer somewhere. Family can't get access to it. It's a problem, and then they'll discover it down the road, which many times could be too late. If you don't have the will, it could or it may not be a problem because the law of intestacy still directs that the living spouse would get some money. The parents, if the person's parents were still living there entitled, the children get it, their children get it. And then if not, the cousins, first cousins on the decedent's side. Now you'll see situations where people will present documents written in their handwriting. This is how they would call it, the dying death will, where they couldn't get the attorney in, or and they write this thing on a piece of paper. Those can be brought to court, but those are very difficult to probate sometimes because there's a big chance for fraud on those documents. The concern for the surrogate court is fraud, and it avoids that by having the documents done by professionals, attorneys.
Actually, a good transition there. Another question. What are some of the risks or folks should be aware of trying to use any kind of online service to prepare these documents? And there's a lot of those sort of available out there. And are there risks and disadvantages people should be aware of before going that route?
You know, it's obviously cheaper. Now, I'm not, for a trust, no way. I would never advise anyone to do a trust by those websites. A will, some of them are fine. But the problem is some of the wills have to be tailored. And unless you have a good service, most of these services you're going to get on the line are cheap. People looking for cheap things. And I'll say this, it's what you pay for the most part. So if you're getting something cheap, you're not going to get something, you're not going to get your desires performed and expressed. And ultimately, you're going to cheat yourself. And more importantly, it's going to cost you money down the road. If there's a fight and you involve lawyers and challenges, it's going to cost the estate more money, a lot more money. So it's not a great idea. Wills are relatively cheap to do with lawyers. I think it's a good thing to do.
Okay. We had a question about what about if someone's a resident of one place but passes in another state, for example, like where should someone be looking for legal assistance in the place where they passed, or should they be looking more in their place of residence?
It's a great question. You present the probate of a will or no will, which would be an administration, in the place of where the person passed, the death, place of death. The death certificate will have that information. It states where the person passed. That's where you probate. However, if you have property, if the person died in New York but has a condo in Florida or a house in Texas, while you file the application in New York, you have to get counsel, you have to get approval in those states to sell those properties. So you have to do two petitions, because property has to be done, the proceedings of property have to be done where the property is located. So there will be a collateral administration or proceeding in those states to sell the property or transfer the deed to that property.
Okay.
But the answer is wherever the person died is where you bring the petition. Good.
Got it. And I know folks have questions, and we're not gonna be able to get to all of them today. There will be a follow-up after this that you guys will receive in the email you use to register for this webinar that will have both John's contact information as well as a recap of this conversation. But before we go, John, one last question. What do you think? You gave us so many pieces of great actionable advice in this time. What would you say if you had to choose the most important thing folks should walk away right now after this and do?
Well, be very cautious. You know, hopefully and God willingly, you don't lose a loved one in this pandemic. But if you do look into it. Make sure that, you know, there was nothing that could have been avoided. You're seeing, and it's a great question because it missed another point I'm trying to say. Now, you'll see politicians, including congressional people, senators, U.S. senators, saying, we're not passing another relief package until we give immunity to the providers. And that's antithesis of what our nation was about. You see, to avoid people doing the wrong things, we have lawsuits. We've had product liability lawsuits for cars. Those lawsuits, whether for medicines, they stopped big corporations from doing the wrong things for the purposes of profit. Okay, those actions were responsible for making corporations do the right thing for people and not profits. And to allow immunity for whatever it is, nursing homes, medical providers, that would be the wrong thing to do here. It would be the same for lawyers. Lawyers they don't deserve immunity. If we do something wrong, we have to be responsible for what we did. And the courts are the Constitution afforded us that opportunity through the court system.
Well, thank you very much. This was a lot of great information to digest. As I mentioned to everyone, you'll receive in your email in the coming days some follow-up with John's contact information as well as a recap of this discussion. And please keep an eye out for more future webinars on a variety of topics, helping keep everybody informed and connect you with some of our local experts. Once again, John, thank you so much for sharing your insight today. We really appreciate it.
Bobby, thank you for your help and all the best. And I want to thank my assistant, Sarah, as well. Bye-bye.
Absolutely. Take care, everybody.